Sunday, and we can see we're just talking about the sun coming in again, and springtime, birds flying. The rain coming, as we know. The plants all need that. So we can feel the air changing, temperature changes, and certainly it's such a heartwarming sensation to be here again at TSS with our lectures and our work, and continue this beautiful work of Allan Kardec, and helping each other in that way. And today I'll be having here Daniel doing our initial prayer, and then following that, Marius is going to sorry, the initial reading for Daniel, then the prayer. Marius is going to do the prayer, and then after that, I'm going to be presenting a short conversation lecture about the concept of apostles of Spiritism. Then I'm going to bring that. That was the theme that was defined for today. Okay. So without any further delays, let's get started. And I'll invite Daniel to come here and do the reading for us.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm going to be reading the book Happy Life. God knows your destiny and commands your life. You deserve what happens to you. The goal is to reach new levels on the scale of evolution. God is the merciful Father and watches over you. Never consider yourself despised or go the way of rebelliousness and blasphemy. Man must practice courage and resignation. With these values, he remains a spiritual child. God plays no favorites and loves us all. Let yourself be led through the situations that you cannot change, and change with love those that may benefit you. Despair? Never.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's take a deep breath and close our eyes. Let's connect our thoughts and hearts to the spirits who are here with us to enlighten us during this study. Let's ask Jesus to open up our hearts and minds so we can learn today and bring all those teachings into our lives. We ask for the speaker to enlighten him and take us to this new word that Kardec brought to us. So be it.
So be it. All right. So today, the topic that was decided during our scheduling was to talk about the apostles of Spiritism. But as I typically do in those cases, I thought about going a little bit back and trying to understand what exactly that word means. What is to be an apostle? And then after that, maybe we together can go through what does that represent in Spiritism, right? So we can help us all situate ourselves in this context, right? 'Cause this is not something that is typically talked about or discussed in Spiritism circles. But I thought in the beginning, I thought it was a little bit of a challenge, but then I was able to flip it around and say, well, maybe it's an opportunity, right? So we can actually talk about this and bring some examples, right? So we can use those examples to learn, right? And this is the best way of learning. As we know, Pestalozzi told us that such a long time ago, right? Learn by experiencing, right? So let's try to do that. Okay. So I'm going to start. I really like the collection by Emmanuel. Some of those, some of the books that he brings by Chico Xavier, The Living Spring, the Pathway to the Light. There's so many books that bring us this really short, um, accurate, and like a punch type message that not more than a page each. But they go through like sometimes half a line of the gospel, right? So they bring like sometimes a half of a sentence almost, right? Um, and then they take that sentence, which is brings in context, brings understanding, and then connects to us, right? He structures it in a very cohesive way. So in the Living Spring, chapter 57, Emmanuel is going to talk about apostles. That's the title of the chapter. And I'm going to read to you some passages from that chapter so we can talk about it. Okay. So he starts with a passage by Paul in a letter to Corinthians. He writes this: "For it seems to me that God has put us apostles lest, right, like men condemned to death. For we have been made spectacles to the world, to angels, to men." So what is he talking about? So Paul is basically saying that, well, it seems like we, the apostles, like we, the first people to serve and to follow, to join Jesus at the time, right? It's like we've been putting last. It's like, we've been taking the brunt of the work. We've been stoned. There's all these things happening to us. I don't understand, right? Aren't we the selected ones? But obviously, Paul did understand, right? He was just giving context to this concept that now Emmanuel is going to bring in more detail. So Emmanuel starts by saying this: an apostle is an educated par excellence, right? So here we go, right? So we're going to take that single word and really go through it in detail. So an educator, right? Willingness to work and self sacrifice live within him or her, or live within the apostle, so that the mind of his or her disciples may be transformed and illuminated in their sense towards higher spheres. Now he's going to make comparisons, and I like this, right? So the legislator, which is a great comparison, right, makes laws that lead to balance and justice, right? The administrator uses material and human resources to provide services, right? So administers, right? The cleric teaches the layperson about faith and the primary expressions. The artist embellishes the way of the mind by opening the heart to edifying messages to the world. The scientist is in awe before the realities of the divine and the wisdom and the laws of the human evolution that created by God. The thinker asks questions, probes transitory phenomena. The doctor aids the sick. The soldier keeps the crowd in order. The worker is active in the any material forms, providing to the mean of preservation of life. And then he stops. So we know all those people, right? What they do. Apostles, however, are guides for the spirit. Now there's this big shift, right? See, everything we're talking about at this point, Emmanuel was talking about professions in a way that every profession has a very specific role in society, right? So, related mostly to material things, to arts, right? To organization, right? The apostles, however, their mission, right, is to guide the spirit. And then he continues, in all great causes of humankind, they are the living institutions revealing by example. Well, that brings another characteristic of the apostle then. Apostle is not really the person that joins first, like the dictionary is going to tell us. It's not the emissary, right? The where the only the emissary, right? Like the dictionary brings to us. But he's the person that will lead and guide the spirit by its own example. Now we can start to think about some people Spirit can be fit into that definition, right? So living amid the world of cause and effects, like we all are, right? Showing themselves the essence of way they teach. So in other words, the true apostle is not the one that's going to preach beautiful words all the time and come in front of people and do these beautiful lectures about things. No. The true apostle is the one that's going to actually teach by actually doing and living by exemplifying what he says or what he believes, right? We have so many examples of that. Like Mother Teresa would be a great example. Like we always think about that. We all know a little bit of the story, right? But she would leave by and aid the poor and do everything she could to help the ones that needed the most, while everyone turned a blind eye to them. She was right there. So she was not going to people and say, "Well, look at these people in poverty." No, she was there actually wiping the wounds of those who needed, right? So this is what Emmanuel is trying to teach to us today, right? The truth they demonstrate are the light that makes shine around others. So by demonstrating their own truths, right, by what they believe, they shine the light to the others, right? So they influence the thoughts of the wise and the ignorant, the rich and the poor, the great and the humble, renewing their way of believing and being so that the world may be uplifted and sanctified by their actions. So now we're giving so much more depth to the definition of what an apostle is, right? Within them arises the equation of facts and ideas with which they make themselves pioneers or defenders by completely giving themselves to others. These are people who really dedicate themselves to others. Now, don't they never in any of these lines here, Emmanuel is saying they need to be perfect, right? Because they don't. And we have great examples by the apostles that we all know, right? The apostles who, the individuals who were selected that we know, right, based on the information that we have, were selected by Jesus at that time, and and gave up everything, right? So these are people who are, fishermen, people who worked, tax collectors, and all sorts of people living in the small communities at that time. Had families and houses and things. They gave up everything they had to follow this man who walk up to them and basically say, "Yep, follow me." Right? That's exactly what he did. But obviously, these spirits, they also knew very well that they were not perfect, but at the same time, they were ready for the mission because, they wouldn't be selected randomly, right? Randomness does not exist in the spiritual world, right? There's always a very well organized process that's in place for everything that happens. But they do, and this is what the man is saying here. They're the pioneers, they're the emissaries, they're the representatives, right, of what they preach or what they do. So by joining Jesus at that time and learning with them, they started to assimilate and incorporate the entire concept of Jesus brought to us. And when the Jesus discarnates, now they are the real emissaries, as the definition of the word in the dictionary, right? Of what that message is. And obviously they will suffer the same consequences of their master, right? Because they were stoned, they were killed, and most of them actually perished by actually defending or representing the law of love, right? Which is exactly what Emmanuel is trying to explain to us. So hence his sensei, they toil and struggle, suffer and grow without rest, facing progress and improvement. Oh, facing many crosses the pain of incomprehension. They represent the spiritual yeast. It's like when those like to cook, you have to bake, right? Doing a bread, right? You put the yeast in it, the ferment, right? The leaven. It's actually a little yeast that's going to grow, right? It's going to produce gases. They'll make that thing grow, right? Without that, we wouldn't have bread, right? We say yeast about the right? But our society depends so much on it. That's like unbelievable, right? But they're the ones that will create that essence that will make that thing you're building on grow and be edible and be you can spread and divide. Like, see how this image is so important, right? So there's a spiritual yeast that leavens the loaf of progress and improvement, right? According to Paul Tarsus, they move through this world like prisoners and they're condemned to incessant suffering because that's exactly what happened, right? Look at the stories of everyone that took that role. Every single one of them are going to be persecuted. Some of them are killed, some are not, but they're all going to feel consequences of it every single time, right? Because they're really, truly representing a transformational change in thought and in action that our society is not ready for, right? And whenever that happens, we tend to shoot them down, right? We still do that. And I'll give you examples that are much more recent, very soon. Okay. So this is because within them, the apostles, we find the positive demonstration of the good of the world, the possibility of being instruments of higher order spirits, and the source of imperishable benefits of all humankind. So that's exactly why Paul said at the beginning, like it's like we're the last ones. We're condemned to be in this situation, and it's true. But he loves that. That's exactly what's the interesting concept of Paul. Because if you just read that line from Paul, it's like Paul's complaining to God. No, he's basically saying, I'm so grateful that I'm in a position that I can actually be the transformation that I want to see in the world. We say this all the time, right? This is like a common thing. That's like a mantra, right? Every time you see someone talking about a positive speeches and stuff like that, and you know, like know yourself kind of thing. They'll say, be the change that you want for the world. Yes, that takes a lot, by the way, right? But it's true, right? We're not saying that that's not true, but think about the image of Paul saying that, and then you understand what I'm trying to say, right? Because he indeed was that, right? He transformed himself, and through his transformation, he transformed the world, right? And so many others after him, right? But this is one example. So now we know what the word apostle means in that sense. I think Emmanuel, by bringing this, and I'll highly recommend you guys reading it. You're probably going to have to read it about 20 times to get the whole thing that he's talking about, right? It's dense, it's so clever, and there's lots of imagery that comes with it that you may totally miss, right, the first time you read. But it's from the Living Spring collection, right? It's the fourth book, right? Okay. So so now we know in the theological concept of apostles, basically are the emissaries, the persons that are first joiners, right? The ones that really convert and join at the first place, right? So in other words, they associate early with whatever person or religious concept we're talking about, right? It doesn't. In our case, obviously, we're talking about Christianism, but there are apostles of technically anything, right? If you apply that specific definition. Now, we know also in Spiritism that if you now look at the concept by Emmanuel, now there's a lot of people that actually fit the criteria to be called an apostle, right? Including many Spiritists, right? And that's where we're going to focus a little bit more now. In particular, if you think about Allan Kardec being the transformative figure for Spiritism, in other words, bringing that entire, we talked about Kardec several times recently. So, but being the person who systematically went through that amount of information, brought it together, organized it, and delivered it. In other words, he transformed this massive amount of concepts and ideas and questions that were burning all through society in America and Europe at that time. He was able to condense that all into something that all of us still read and deliver it to us. So he is the coding person, right? That's why we call him whatever you want to call it, codificator or whatever. But he's the person that organized all that and delivered that information to us. Now, who are the initial followers of that? So think about the same concept of the apostle in this sense. There are a number of people at that time that were working very tightly with Kardec and took on key roles at actually after Kardec discarnated, right, and continuing that mission, right. And some of them are well known. For example, Leon Denis, right, that worked side by side with Kardec for many years and basically continued not only as an accessory role, but also as a key element of bringing spiritists together, because it could have disappeared right after Kardec passed, right? There was a if you think about it, if it wasn't for this second wave of individuals that maintained that treadmill going, right, a lot of what we know today may have disappeared. A lot of what we do here, if the treadmill doesn't continue and more people come, and even in a spiritual center like ours, for example, there's always this ongoing process, right, of people leading the way, maintaining the work. So Leon Denis is a good example. There are some that are not well known. So, for example, Camille Flammarion, and even more, Gabrielle Delaine, for example, is very few people talk about it in Spiritism, but also those three individuals were probably the key leaders, right, of Spiritism at the early stages in France. And then obviously that started to spread throughout the world and reaches many countries, some early than others, like Brazil, for example. And then in Brazil, there are other spirits that were fundamental in developing what we know today. Because see, a lot of the information we got here does not come directly from France, actually comes through Brazil in a vast majority of cases, right? So in other words, you see how the spirituality organized things in such a way that there's always this continuum of people and places. So there's no boundaries to this, right? We keep saying country X and Y, but reality is that this is a global phenomenon, right? Bezerra de Menezes, obviously, it will be the early key figure, right, in the early development of the Spiritist movement in Brazil, the creation of the Federação Espírita Brasileira at that time, and then Eurípides Barçanufo, we were going to talk about a lot today, and then much later on, Chico Xavier and others, right? So those are the ones that we know more today because they're closer to us, but I'm going to bring some of the early figures back in so we can talk about that, right? So the idea that we're not talking about the apostles like the 12 anointed ones that were selected by Jesus, no, because I truly believe even that the information that we have of the 12 selected ones is completely biased by the way history delivers that information to us, right? The truth is, if you carefully look at those texts, you'll see that there's so many people following Jesus at that time, many females that have a tiny role in the text that delivered to us, but most likely have a major role in the society, in that small group of people at that time. But that information wouldn't be delivered to us, right? Because of the bias of the messenger, right? At that time. And multiple biases of a society that does not give roles to women, right? So I don't even believe that the 12 are 12, right? So I think that information is probably a little bit not complete, let's put it this way. So we're not talking about that, right? So we're really talking about more recently now. Who are the people that are leading this, right? And why are we here, right? Let's pay some tributes to that, okay? So let's talk about Leon Denis, and I'm trying to keep my time on track here. So unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to talk about all of them because there's many. But I selected one that I think a couple at least that have a like an interesting connection, and you see what I'm trying to say. So Leon Denis, born in 1846, right? What is interesting about Leon Denis is that, as you see, is a common theme on these individuals that we're talking about. They always have this inquisitive mind. They have self-thought. They go after information. They're always active. They're always in the community. They're always engaged. They're always doing something, right? These are not individuals that are just sitting down and saying, yeah, I'm tired. I don't know what to do. You never hear that in any one of these individuals that we talk about, right? Because that drive to change, to move things, is actually, I think, is one of the fundamental aspects, right, of being that transformational figure. So he used to really enjoy going in and read books and all that. At the time, people had bookstores were a thing, right? They're still a thing, but they were much more of a thing at that time because we didn't have the internet and Audible and all those ebooks and things like that. So yeah, people used to go actually to the bookstore and spend hours kind of looking at what is the new book, what is the new thing, and just talk to the person like you went in, and then someone publishes something. This is like a one only book because they couldn't print you know 5 million books copies at the same time, right? So there's a little bit of context here, right? Because I'm going to say that he used to go through the bookstore just to find new things to read. People can say, like, does that make no sense? Just Google it, right? That's what we do nowadays. But that's the thing at that time. So he would, when he was 18 years old, he does his thing, right, to go to the bookstore, and he finds a copy of the Spiritist book by Kardec, right? And you see, if you put in the timeline, this is just about 10 years or less than 10 years after Kardec published the book, right? Um, and when he was reading through it, and as it happens to many of us here, and I can tell you, it did happen to me big time. It's like the more I read into the book, the more the concepts were already part of me. And I'm like, I'm just pulling that from. It's like it's not new, right? I'm like, of course this is like, why didn't I think about this before, right? So that connection was already there, meaning that we've been experiencing this before. Like we as a spirit, you know, we have this right into our memories, into our experiences, and same as him, right? Obviously Catholic at the time, but being exposed to that, he reconnects to that, and differently from a lot of what people considered at that time, that he was just he was um, like a side person to Kardec. Let's put it this way, right? No, actually, he did have a key role in Spiritism, and I'll touch on that in a minute, right? Um, uh, and then after he reads the book for the first time, and then obviously he's mesmerized by it, he goes and contact Kardec, right? And by contacting Kardec, they obviously it is all planned, nothing by chance, right? These two spirits are prepared for probably hundreds of years to get into this mission, right? So they go together and then they start to work together at the time of the Parisian Society of the Spiritist Society at that time, right? Um, so he writes, and I think one of the books that is really transformational for Leon Denis is called Here and Hereafter, right? Um, and he writes something that I really like to quote very often when I'm giving any lecture. He says, "To attain to perfection, faith must rest on a solid basis of free examination, liberty of thought, instead of dogma and mystery." Right? It must recognize those principles that depend on direct observation and study of natural laws, such as the nature of Spiritist faith. Why is this important? Because along with Kardec, and this is part that some people don't really recognize, he was the one that actually went through with Kardec, obviously, where they're working together, but he went through all the specific approaches, or in a scientific way, to gather all information and start to organize things of like, why does it happen, and question it, just like Kardec was doing. He was doing the same thing, right? And he brings us all to it in the Here and Hereafter, in other also other books, and then later on he talks a lot more in-depth concepts about psychological concepts, but this is much later in his life. Like the first part is really a very hard work of reorganizing things, questioning scientifically, and trying to prove through many different experiments of why things is real or not real, or true or not. Right? He has a pivotal role in that. So when he met Kardec at that time, he was assigned as the development of the doctrine studies at that time, or the spiritual studies we say today, right? Mediumistic research. He was doing it, and he was also very tightly related to bringing together the Spiritist movement in France. So he was contacting all the Spiritist centers at the time, just like we're doing now. Like I'm the Canadian Spirit Society, Canadian Spirit Council. I'm part of a unification group. So in other words, my role there is actually to contact Spiritist centers and talk to them and help bring new centers and talk to people that want to bring study groups to different cities. That's what we do today in CSC. But not because we're super special, no, because Leon Denis taught us how to do this, right? He was the one doing it, right, in France at that time. And we know that this is a key element of bringing this knowledge to other people, right? So, and the consolidation of that movement in France at that time was primarily the works of Leon Denis, right? Kardec was writing all the work and doing all, we all know what Kardec was doing at that time, but just I wanted to give that perspective that Kardec alone was not doing all of this, right? There's all these people working together with him. So the list of his works, for example, include obviously many books. The first one was published in 1903, and the final ones in 1924. In the Invisible, another key book, the first book that he published, is a practical guidebook about experimental spiritism. So he was the one sitting down these meetings and taking notes and saying, okay, why is this happening? Why is this chair? Why are we going to prove that this is right, that this is wrong? How I'm going to ask a question to that spirit to do this? How, that's what he was doing, right? And obviously together with Kardec, right? So in the Invisible, and I'll give you a perspective of what the book talks about. So the chapters are, for example, he writes something we call the Treaty of Experimental Spiritualism, right? Just like a medical treaty, like something like, we're describing, like he does that, right? He talks about facts and laws. He talks about spontaneous phenomena. He talked about materialization of things. He talks about testing methods. So he's agreeing with this compendium, with the idea is that he's writing this to give to people out there, right, somewhere in the world, say, if you really want to know what this is and how to test it, how to make sure that this is the right thing, here it is in the Invisible. That's the book. See, there's a treaty of this. There's the laws, testing methods, training. He writes about that. So he is the guy putting that work down on the ground, right? How to identify spirits, for example, whether whether or not what the intention behind the connection, right? So that's how he organizes his work, and it's again a lot of what we incorporate now. The information coming all the way from Brazil and other places, all the way here, are primarily centered on the work of the Denis too, right? Not only so we kind of ignored some of those figures in history, right? So he talks, for example, about some scientists that joined the Spiritist movement at the beginning. For example, Charles Richet. He won a Nobel Prize in 1913 for recognizing anaphylaxis, by the way. He's the guy that described it first. But little we know is that Richet is also part of the initial Spiritists, right? Working with Leon Denis in the Prison Society, right? And there's for example, he saw one of the seances, right? Richard was there. So he started to see movements and not only movements, but also some appearances, right, of spirits. He could see it. So he's the one that coined the term ectoplasm, right? So it's something that we use all the time nowadays, right? So that comes from Richard working with Leon Denis, and it's also the book In the Invisible, right? That's actually described by Leon Denis. And he was, as at the time, again, another little historical context, right? At that time, a scientist, it was by the like a scientist was by definition um, like like a master's or a PhD or doctor of methods, not necessarily a topic, right? So this is still very true here in University of Toronto, for example, in other universities, but in other places of the world nowadays, you have doctorate degrees or PhD degrees in a very specific thing, right? Which is like an antithesis to idea of what a real PhD is. But that's like a side. At that time, so if you're a scientist, you're actually you will study anything, right? Because you're a doctor of the method, basically the scientific method, right? So he was part of the Society for Physical Research in the UK. He was part of many scientific societies all over, and he would teach different subjects, right? Because we were not bound by a very narrow focus on research, right? So it's a little bit different. But Richard was very important too, right, in early Spiritism, right? Um, so he wrote, and in many of his work, scientific work, that there's no contradiction between the theories of Spiritism and the established science. He is the first one of the first scientists to join that group, right? That was very supportive of Leon Denis and Kardec at that time, right? And he described he reviews with Leon Denis. He reviews thousands of communications, just like Kardec was doing, right, for the 5 books of Spiritism, right? So Leon Denis also talks about the number of physicists, chemists, philosophers, all those people that gathered together at that time during these meetings, right, to talk about Spiritism, which each one of them were actually very important too, right, because they were the first ones to convert, right, let's put it this way, right? Um, the other one, I'm gonna have to skip this one because I don't have a lot of time. But Gabriel Delane was also key at that time, and Gabriel, with his father, founded the French Spiritist Union, right, which is kind of the Brazilian Spiritist Federation kind of thing, right, at that time. And Delane also worked with Leon Denis and Kardec at that time, and they were all key elements, right, in this early development of Spiritism, right? Now I'm gonna jump now because I want to make the connection between Denis, Bezerra de Menezes, and Euripides. So Bezerra de Menezes, we know a little bit of the story. He was born in 1831, Ceará, and he is probably very well recognized as the one of the early and most important figures in Spiritism in Brazil, right? Now, common to all these individuals is that by the age of 11, he's already teaching, right? So you can kind of get a sense of this is not your run out of the mill spirit that comes and, to enjoy earth, right? So this is a spirit that comes really with like there's a mission and my eyes are on it, right? So he started studying and learning things on by himself, right? He started studying Latin, right? And then when he finishes Latin, he's hired to teach Latin to kids by the age 13, right? And then you can think, yeah, that's something about there that doesn't fit the curve, right? 1851 to 56, he go to Rio de Janeiro to study medicine. And if you calculate the time, yeah, he's 20 years old at that time. And at that time, 20 years old doing this is unheard of, right? Nowadays, yeah, you can get to grad studies by that time, but not a common thing at that time, right? So after he finished med school, he works for the army. He works as a doctor in many places in Rio de Janeiro. He runs for the city as the city representative, the councillor, right? So he wins, and then the state legislature, he wins again, and then something that will be similar to the mayor of the city at that time. Remember, there was not Rio City at that time, like multiple different cities separated. But he was also elected, right? This is all like in a role. He was a politician. There's a lot of things to help the society at that time. And he is, interesting enough, and history doesn't pay that tribute to him that often, he is an abolitionist. So I remember that time we had still have slavery, right? And he was one of the first figures in the political world, right, to actually write an essay. Again, we're going to say, well, but why he would write an essay about it, right? Sounds like you're doing undergrad school studies, right? No, because at that time we didn't have TikTok or Instagram or Twitter rage kind of thing, right? So you wouldn't like tweet this 180 characters about how slavery is bad. He actually writes an essay and publishes in the newspaper, right, about it. And at that time, that was the shocking thing, right? Because people used to read that, right? It's called O País with a Z at the end, which is interesting. This is one of the largest newspapers at the time. So he writes it. Obviously, he gets heat for it, right? Because, come on, he's dealing with, the elite of the society at that time. Um, but I like that part because it truly shows who he is, right? He's always fighting the common power politic thing, right? He is always going against what people expect him to do, right? So in Spiritism, so it's in 1875, and this is an interesting story. He's a friend of Joaquim Travassos. Joaquim Travassos is another doctor in Brazil at that time in Rio, and he's the one that translated the Spirits book the first time. And then there are many other translations after that. But he translates from French to Portuguese, and then gives a copy to Bezerra, right? And Bezerra gets the book, and he actually writes. I love Bezerra because he writes about this stuff, right? So we actually have the information from him, right? So he writes about this going to the like a train, like a streetcar ride, right, with the book, and going so deep into the book, he basically like forgets even kind of where he's going, right? And again, he gets so connected to it, and again, pulling from his preparation, right, to be there. Um, uh, he starts studying it. He starts talking to people about it, right? So obviously, he gets a lot of heat for it because this is like a very mainstream Catholic society at that time. He goes basically against everything again. Like that's his transformational figure. And then one day, and I like this passage because nowadays, again, you would probably do a Facebook post, but he goes in into the city and sets up a meeting in a public thing. Right? So that's the people. Oh, the Dr. Bezerra is going to talk. Who's going to give a lecture or something? So he goes in and he talks about 2,000 people, according to some historians, about why he's joining Spiritism. Right, that was his talk. Right, and then it was so big that the Opais at that time actually writes a note about that speech, right? Just to say, well, he said this, which is a big thing, right? And he continues to publish articles on the same journal now about Spiritism, right? Which is again another transformational thing, right, to happen. So in '89, he's the first president of Brazilian Spiritist Federation, and by now he's working very much into Spiritism, right? And he discarnated in the 1900s, right? Now, obviously, there's a ton more Bezerra Menezes has done, but it's not. We can have a whole day about him. But the reason why I wanted to make that connection is because you see now there's Kardec and Leon Denis and Famaillon and all those people, and then comes a copy of the book, right, in the hands of Bezerra. Bezerra gets connected back, right? So Bezerra starts his work on it, right? And about the same time, this young individual, born in Sacramento, Minas Gerais, called Euripides Barçanufo, is gonna get a copy of a book also, but he's gonna get a copy of the book of Leon Denis, right, by his friend, right? Same idea, right? Nothing happening by chance. And he reads into that book, and then he's like, well, a lot, and he writes about that too. He says, now pretty much all the questions he had about the Catholic upbringing he had are now addressed, right? And then he moves into Spiritism. But so Euripides is one of 15 siblings, right? So Murgico, Dona Meca, parents. And if you really want to hear some interesting take on Euripides, there's a DVD by Oceano de Mello. He actually he has a DVD about the history of it's available online, I think, about Euripides Bossa Nova, and I highly recommend it because again, one of the key elements in Spiritism that very few people talk about, right? I know we read books by Chico Xavier mediumship all the time, by Divaldo all the time. They're fantastic mediums. We know their work, but there's a lot of other people out there that we should think about too. Okay, so coincidence or not, so by the age of 9, Euripides is actually helping their teachers, right? And I think about that because I have a 9-year-old too. But 1902, he opened. So he finished school, right? So he opened his own school, right? It's called Liceu Sacramento, 1902, with his former teachers, right? So think about this. Like this is a kid, right? Goes off to school, opens the school with his own teachers, right? So that's him. And at the same time, he opens a charity that runs with the school called Amiguinhos dos Pobres. So, um, and to help the poor, of course, right? He self-learns. And now, this is now Sacramento, Minas Gerais, Brazil, 1889 or so, right? So we say this, and we don't have spiritual like a context history. This makes no sense. But he's self-learning law, medicine, pharmacy, right? Why? Because that didn't exist at that time. Like zero. Like there's no doctors around, right? And I know a little bit about it too because my grandmother we discriminated last year. She used to be the like the nurse practitioner type of thing at her city in Tocantins, state of Brazil, further north. But she delivered, I don't know, probably like 2 or 3 thousand kids through her lifetime, right? And and again, she had no high, like there's no university for this thing, right? It's just like bring her, she knows what to do, kind of thing, right? And she knew what to do, right? And that's a repeat. He was doing the same thing. It was like, okay, I need to know how to do this, right? So he self learns all of that stuff. Um, but he doesn't stop there, right? So he started learning about astronomy, about math, about philosophy, again in Sacramento, Minas Gerais, in 1880s, right? So now you can. There's no teachers for this, right? There's no school for this. This is like a rural community, nothing, right? Um, and he gets elected as a councilor for the city in 1902. I mean, the similarities there. Um, Now, interesting. As a Catholic, and pretty much Catholic Church was like 99.9% of the society at that time, right? In particularly in the rural areas. And he gets the Bible as a gift, right? And he reads all through it, but he's not really happy with. Has a lot of questions. Um, and at the same time, his family has been going to this spiritual meetings in a farm close to the city, and he's very concerned about that because obviously that would be against the dogmatic view of the religion at that time, right? So his name is Tio Mariano. Tio Mariano is his uncle, and so he goes to the spiritual meetings in this farm, and imagine like how society is seeing this, right? Someone tells you that I'm gonna go to this farm like 15 kilometers from the city to talk to spirits. I'm like, hell no! Like I don't, this is like devil's work. Don't talk to me kind of thing. You're gonna burn to hell. Like that's still the concept of medieval times that survived, right? But he's convinced to go to one of these meetings, and he receives from him a copy of the book After Death by Leon Denis, right? So he reads it, and then he writes about it, and I like it. Interesting because as he says, it is one of the first time he understands, for example, the idea of the Beatitudes, like the Beatitudes by John the Evangelist, right? That talks to us about the idea of the poor and the meek, and the ones that suffer are the ones that will get the reward, kind of thing, right? So that's what the Beatitudes talks about, right? He had a hard time understanding it. So he goes to this meeting one day, and he asks to the medium. He asks the questions like, can someone explain to me what the Beatitudes? What is this, right? So at the meeting, he gets the answer by John himself, right? Explaining to him what it is. And that was kind of the transformation of his life, right? He's like, okay, so this can't be happening, right? So he starts to get into that, right? So he opens a Spiritist Center shortly after that in 1905. It's called Esperança e Caridade. He opens like a pharmacy to deliver homeopath medication to people in need, guided by who? Bezerra Menezes, right? Who's now, well, this is the overlap between them. Um, and and he starts going to the meetings all the time. And in one of the meetings, now his school, he just opened not too long ago, is not going really well, right? Because he's now working in the Spiritist Center and the charity work and all those things. His school is winding down. They're locking the school. The people are reclaiming the building. They have to sell the furniture. The school is practically done. And then he has this spirit approaches him, um, and it's based on most of the descriptions is that appeared like it was a highly elevated spirit, but he was feeling so down that he said it's impossible for a highly elevated spirit. Look at the spiritist mindset, right? It's impossible for such a highly elevated spirit to come and talk to me when I'm so bad, like I'm so down, like I'm so depressed, I don't want to talk to anyone. This is impossible. Get away from me. You're certainly not who you're saying you are. And it kind of pushes the spirit away from him, right? But the spirit happens to be an emissary of Mary, right? And basically he's through passes, he's put to sleep, and a message appears. And the message from Mary through this emissary of Mary is basically reopen your school, change the name to Allan Kardec School, start teaching about concepts of the law of love and Spiritism, open Spiritist studies, and open a charity that runs along the school, and we'll take care of the rest. He does that. And lo and behold, he opens this Allan Kardec School, and it booms, right? It turns into a Spiritist Center school. Now, this concept of having a school, Spiritist Center, pharmacy, through all those things combined together into this massive complexes that we see in Brazil, come from this guy, right? That's exactly when that concept of opening Euripides, the idea of having all this complex activities happening in the same roof, right? That happens in Brazil everywhere, right? We have it in Massachusetts, like all those different places. They follow kind of the same script, and this is all based on this story, right? And he continues his mission, right? And I don't have a lot of time. There's this two stories that I really like to tell about Euripides. So Euripides, he has this incredible mediumship, right? Of cure first. And his mediumship of cure is different from what most people see it, though. Like you'd see mediumship of cure is like, someone brings in, like someone who's sick to the Spiritist Center, someone does something like impose his hand or something, or pray, and the patient gets better, right? That's how we see the cure happening, right? And by the way, that does not happen all the time. It only happens if the individual really deserves it, right? The patient, right? The healer has no power of changing the course of someone's life if they don't deserve it, right? That doesn't exist, by the way. There's just like a side here because we see so many people trying to find a cure, like I'm going to find a cure of this guy. That will never happen, right? Unless the cure has already happened inside of you and you deserve it, right? By the way. But, he had the ability of curing people, right? But he would get these messages from his mentors like, go help, and what is his name? I forgot the name of the guy. Oh boy, what's the name of the guy? Oh, Senor Carlos. So go help Senor Carlos. He's not eating for 3 days and not drinking water for three days. You got to go help him. And then he's like, I have no clue what Carlos is. So he goes to his father, like, do you know anyone by the name of Senor Carlos? Like a small place, like we know each other kind of thing, right? A friend of whatever. Oh yeah, I know. He lives on the road, 3 kilometers away, whatever. Just go there. It's like, yeah, I need to go see him tonight, right? So he goes there. So he goes to the places no one asked for it, right? And he helps the people. And there's the other story, and he ended up helping this. It's a very well known story for him. And the other story is that he would help delivering babies too, right? But he has another interesting mediumistic abilities that he could he used his double body, right? He used his spiritual body to go places while his physical body is still in another place, so he can be in two places at the same time, type of thing, right? That obviously is reported very much in history through many saints in Catholic Church, right? In many different traditions and Spiritism too. So in one of the episodes, he's teaching in a school, right? And he tells the students like, there's a man coming and he needs help for his wife who is delivering a baby. But don't worry, I've already delivered the baby. And then the guy comes. It's like, oh my God, Dr. Ripidis, I need help. My baby is not doing well. He's like, don't worry, go back. She's fine. And the baby's fine too. And he's like, what do you mean? It's like, I just delivered them. And then everyone's like, what's going on, right? The guy can't believe. And he's like, I can't believe it. It's like, okay, so let's go there. So they go back there to their house. And when he gets to the house, the wife of the guy tells him, like, Dr. Barsanufo, why are you back? We're doing fine. And then the guy goes completely nuts, right? Because it's like, how is this happening, right? So he actually went there and helped deliver the baby, right? And then when they got back, for the woman, she was seeing him for the second time, right? Because she was able to see her spiritual body, basically, right? As a real body, right? He could densify his spiritual body so in such a way that he would show himself, right? To that. Anyways, a lot of interesting story. But as many of the other apostles, he was he was um, he was a subject of many lawsuits from many people um, from illegal practice of medicine. First, it was dismissed, and then it was for many other I can't remember all of them. There were several lawsuits against him and challenges from priests, from Catholic Church, from all sorts of levels of society because of his charity work and because obviously every time you do that again you're transforming things you're driving this change that society sometimes has a hard time understanding, right, and following. um, but so he dies in 1918 of the Spanish flu. He was only 38 at that time. But interestingly enough, he receives the message that he was about to go, and he keeps working to the last minute, basically, although he was sick. Um, and São Vicente de Paulo at that time comes to his house. It was his mentor, and said, my son, it's your mission's over. Like it's time to go back. Right. So again, not a punishment, it was actually his reward, right? He was his mission. But I can guarantee you, because we know he communicated through Chico many times after that, right? So I'm sure that he's still around. Like Bezerra, he elected to stay here with us, right? Because Bezerra could be, dealing with a lot of other higher level issues, I would say, in spiritual world, but he elected to stay with us to help us out, and I'm pretty sure Euripides is doing the same thing. Okay, so yeah, so that was the couple examples of the apostles of what will be an apostle for us, right? In this context of spiritism, I wanted to bring, but most importantly, I wanted to highlight this complex spiritual work that is done in the background that we're not aware of all the time, right? That's happening and is allowing us to do this, right? This is like a monumental amount of work that's been happening for thousands of years, and there's all this spirits that come here and then that drives and push things a lot faster than they would have been otherwise, right? We're here kind of little ants kind of crawling around and taking these little pieces of leaf, back to the house and kind of stuff. This guy's come with like a airplane speed and like pushes hundreds of years, right, in a day, right? And that's why it's so important for us to remind them. Okay, thank you all. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to address if I can. I don't know if there's anything on the internet there. No?
I have
Yes.
a quick
Yes.
It's interesting the role of Brazil and Brazilians, even though
Yeah.
you said it's a global
Yeah.
movement all
Sure.
the time.
Yeah.
And I could see several friends that live in France, live
Yes.
in the US, and
Yes.
most likely the Spiritist centers are led by Brazilians.
True. Yeah.
And especially in France, I had my brother like living there a while ago, and he said everywhere I went was always a Brazilian in front of the center.
Yeah.
And it's how interesting we are kind of the message, passing this through. And like, I don't know why, I'm still like
God is Brazilian. Yeah, that's a great question. In the book Brasil, Coração do Mundo, Pátria do Evangelho, Ismael explains in the beginning of the book a lot of that, right? Of this is not random, right? This is all kind of planned out, and obviously we born in Brazil as a spirit or anywhere in the world makes no difference. But the idea is that there were an influx of spirits that incarnated in Brazil with a specific role of doing exactly that, of spreading that message to other countries and to Brazil and solidifying the movement, being the heart of the movement in that sense, right? Being there, like in Brazil. Now, other societies definitely have and will have a much harder time understanding some of these concepts because they've been pushed to the sidelines because of many other reasons, right? But I think when I say global is because Spiritism itself is not the only way the message is delivered, though, right? And I just say that out loud and clear to everyone to hear, because I don't want us in Spiritism to feel like we're better, right? Or we're above, or we're the holders of the whole truth, right? We're not, right? We're working with information we have, right? And we're working together, right, to the growth of the entire universe, right? But I can talk to friends that have no religion. They have a much deeper understanding of some of the concepts that I try to understand that I have. So what I'm trying to say global, because yes, we're bringing this more structural, organized collection of information that Kardec brings to us, we call Spiritism. But in every single place around the world, these drivers that these guys are in Spiritism, they're there too, right? On their own niche, on their own knowledge, on their own. So see, Jesus told us, right? I'm not coming to break the law. And they're doing the same in their own places, right? Driving this transformation, this better understanding of loving each other, respecting each other, growing together, and being more loving and passionate, and it's like all this is happening. So it is a global phenomenon. But you're right. Like in this context of Spiritism, the organization was done in this particular way, right? Now, do we know what's going to happen in 100 years? I don't know. Will Canada be it? I don't know. Like, will Australia be it? Who knows, right? But you're absolutely right. There's a reason for that to happen, right? But at the same time, we should not close our eyes to the fact that this is also happening everywhere. And I think one of the things about Spiritism that makes me so happy about being Spiritist is exactly because I'm allowed to question these things, right? And I'm allowed to say, well, it's okay for be different. It's okay to learn different ways. It doesn't matter really. Like we're all in it together, right? Kind of thing. So, and I think that's what I meant by being global. It is global, right? If you take a label out of it, it is a global phenomenon. Yeah, it's a great comment.
I have one comment
Yes.
now by Johanna Weiss. She says, "Thanks for this. Very interesting to know more about Euripides and Bezerra, and know their stories have come together, help to connect with the doctrine. I know, for example, Joana de Cusa was crucial to Brazil's independence.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that happened when she was as Joana de Cusa, but I know she played a big role in Brazil's independence. I watched a lecture on it at a spirit center in Brazil. This information I understand how has an influence on the story as an abolitionist."
Yes. Correct. Yeah, that's so important. So many of this figures, in that you see they're incarnating multiple times, and we have that by many books, right? So we have obviously the Emmanuel romances, right? That talks about multiple incarnations of the same spirit and how they transform society and themselves, right? We have the example of Joanna. That's a great example that did incarnate back in Brazil and didn't incarnate. So obviously, from a historical perspective, this is interesting. Although Kardec himself made it clear to us that we shouldn't be wasting time trying to figure out who incarnated as who at any time in history, because that's going to be like solving this like 5 million pieces puzzle that we have no guide or no images on it. It's like just randomly picked pieces, and it doesn't help. But it's right to say that yes, for those histories that we were allowed to know, right? There's clear evidence that many of them have critical roles in different countries and different places, right? There's this book called Eustáquio that talks about the 14 incarnations of this spirit, and it talks about all the way from he was in war, like destroying civilizations and killing each other, all the way to this 14th incarnation on Earth, where he's now rescuing all the people dying in the war in Europe, right? So that's kind of the same idea, right? Some of those stories come to illustrate it. Joanna is a great example, right? Comes to illustrate the importance of the spirits coming and kind of pushing society, right, at different times. And it's a great example, yeah. Okay. All right. Anything else? No? Okay. So thank you all. We're going to have a very short prayer now, so we can say goodbye to our friends on the internet there. Thank you for listening. We're going to have a very short prayer now, and we get